I've been studying for a long time trying to figure out this enigma. How do non-Jews, non-Israelites in Paul's letters become Abraham's family? In fact, Abraham's literal seed, his sperm. How does that happen? Well, this scholar has helped unravel something I have never seen explained in this manner. To such a degree, she solved the riddle for me. And I've been dealing with various groups that have different ideas about this issue. And now I think I've come to a conclusion. How did Paul call these non-Israelites Abraham? Abraham's descendants? Well, pagan Rome had more influence on the Jews than we think. And you're going to want to watch this entire episode. I can't brag enough about this scholar. Her book has blown my mind and helped me come to a conclusion that I wasn't sure I'd be able to find. But I did. And let me know if you think it's the case as well. Her book has also won the Jewish National Book Award category Scholarship. MythVision. Ladies and gentlemen, this will be one of the best shows. I honestly loved this book. I'm telling you, the guest we have today, in just one chapter of this book, has solved a riddle I have been searching for multiple years. And this is not exaggeration. I highly recommend everyone watching, go in the description. This is a book I can't brag enough about. I always recommend good books to you, but I'm telling you, when it comes to solving the riddle of conversion and dealing with identity of who's Israel, why is Paul doing what he's doing, all of these things, we're going to get into this and much, much more, because this wonderful lady here on the screen that you see has done some serious research. And so with that being said, welcome to MythVision, Dr. Katel Berthelot. I'm trying. Correct me. How do you pronounce it?
Katel Berthelot.
Berthelot. I try. I really do. But I'm going to try to refer to you as Katel to make it easy on me, if that's okay.
Sure.
Awesome. Thank you for joining. This is your first time, so I have to at least give people your background and what you're doing right now. And then in future episodes, maybe we can shortcut and get straight to the material, but I want them to know your expertise. So that way they know what kind of caliber of academic pursuit you are on, like where are you at in your thinking? And let me tell you, I can learn quite a bit from her as well as you. So stay tuned. Dr. Katel, a professor, she's a professor at the Center National, or let me just say CNRS organization, and a member of the Paul Albert Février. Am I saying that right?
Centre Paul Albert Février.
I'll allow you to say it. Research Center at the Aix-Marseille University. Her field is the history of Judaism in the Greco-Roman world, with a particular focus on Jewish literature in Greek, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and rabbinic literature. Her research interests include the reception history of biblical text, various issues connected to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the reception of Greek ethical and political ideas in Jewish thought, the impact of Hellenistic royal models, and Roman imperial ideology upon Jewish institutions and thought, and more generally, the interactions between Jews and non-Jews in the Greco-Roman world. Her PhD, Sorbonne University, 2001, was on the accusations of misanthropy against the Jews in antiquity and the Jewish responses to these charges. Her books include a selection in Search of the Promised Land, the Hasmonean Dynasty, Between Biblical Models and Hellenistic Diplomacy, 2017. The Gift of the Land and the Fate of the Canaanites in Jewish Thought, 2014. Philanthropia Judaica. Am I saying that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Supplements to the Journal for the Study of Judaism, 2003. And her current book right now that I hope everyone goes and gets a copy of is Jews and Their Roman Rivals. I can't refer to this enough. So please, if you don't mind, I'll make it really simple. Can you tell us what makes your work unique? Which ideas do you present that are novel or take a different angle than some of your colleagues? But in that question, maybe we should start with, what is your book about? Well, what is the whole point?
Okay, so my book is about the encounter between Romans and Jews. And just to give you an idea of the history of research on this topic, Roman Jerusalem has been a very, very much researched topic. And people have written a lot about the political and military confrontation between Jews and Romans, the free Jewish revolts against Rome, and also the legal status of Jews within the Roman Empire, as well as the image of Rome in Jewish literature, in Jewish texts. So these have been the major focuses up to the last few years, maybe. What I wanted to do in my book was to ask a different question, namely, was Rome a different kind of challenge as an empire for Jews than the empires that Israel had been confronted to in the past? We'll probably go back to that, but the history of Israel can be seen as a history of confrontations with empires. And then, and of course, I answer this question in a positive way. I argue that Rome is, in fact, a unique challenge for Jews in antiquity as an empire. And from there, I move to a second question, which is what did this encounter with Rome change in the history of Israel, in the history of Jewish thought? Namely, I'm not focusing on the events on the ground, like, okay, the Second Temple was destroyed. That's a major change. Right. But what I'm interested in is the changes in the perspective that Jews had on themselves, their law, their interactions with others, their use of military force, or the way they integrated newcomers, be they proselytes, converts, whatever you want to call them, the way they considered Israel as a people. What did the encounter with Rome change in the way they reflected about all these topics?
Right.
That's the first thing to say. But the second thing is also that my book focuses on pagan Rome and not Christian Rome. And many scholars have considered that Rome started to be perceived by Jews as a rival or as an entity that wanted to substitute itself for Israel only when the empire became Christian from the 4th century onward. And what I am arguing in the book is that already before that, in 1st century BC and the first 3 century CE, Rome started to be perceived by at least some Jews as an entity that tried to substitute itself for Israel. And this is really new. For instance, Jacob Neusner is a very famous specialist of rabbinic literature, wrote in a book on Persia and Rome in classical rabbinic literature that, until the 4th century, until the Christianization of Rome, Rome meant nothing special for the rabbis. It was just a place to be. It was, a physical place and a political entity, but nothing special. It did not symbolize something beyond itself. And he said that Rome became a real challenge for Jews only as when it became Christian, and then it became a real threat. So I'm really challenging this kind of views.
Wow. So that raises some interesting questions, because if that is the case, then we might have to reevaluate some of the ideas. Being I come from the biblical side of things, right? Specifically, since you're focused on the whole picture, that's what your expertise really is going to deal with. You're handling so much material. I look at things like, and just to give you like an interesting angle, I'll look at things like the Gospel of Matthew and see how, in the words of Jesus, it'll say something like, I'm taking this kingdom away from you and giving it to I'm taking this away from you and giving it to a new nation. And I always thought, like, who is this? Is this just the Christian nation? Or is it potentially saying, I'm giving this to Rome? I don't know. It makes me wonder, because you do see these hints of it almost seems like, Vespasian is viewed as a Messiah-like figure in Josephus. Are there some authors who are thinking Rome's taking over the messianic implication here? I don't know. It makes me have a lot of questions that I don't know the answer to, but it makes me kind of wonder if we should reevaluate some of that material in light of what you just said. Just questions in my head. I'm speaking out loud. So I do want everybody to take a moment. If you haven't already done so, which means you've already did a no-no, you have to go to Amazon. You got to get the book. I can't tell you how fascinating this book is. If you can't afford the hardcover, no worries. Go get the Kindle. This book, it is endlessly entertaining with great information. She has visuals from time to time, but every page is written clear so everyone can understand what she's actually saying. And she's sourcing it with various sources, whether it be Talmudic, Mishnaic, the Tosefta. It doesn't matter if it's Jewish. It can even be Roman sources, authors, historians. She's doing amazing work. So go check it out. And also, we'll go ahead and get our second question out of the way. And that is, well, I guess you kind of answered why your work is different because you're doing something new. But would you take us through a brief history of Israel and its interactions with the empires of different periods, i.e., Egypt, Neo-Assyria, Neo-Babylon, Persia, Greece, then Rome? I know that's a lot, so maybe we just do like a drive-by, like a flyover, explaining how this relates to your work and why that matters and how it was viewed in each universal kingdom, if I could use the term.
Sure. So as I said previously, the history of Israel can be viewed as a history of imperial encounters. And we have to remember that Israel is located in a strategic place in the Near East, or the Levant, as we also say, in between Mesopotamia in Asia and Egypt in Africa. And it's like a corridor connecting these two continents. So it was always an area that was very much coveted by the big empires of antiquity. And it's not a comfortable place to live in, to be in the Levant and to be in ancient Israel. So if we think about Israel's encounters with empires from a historical point of view, not from a biblical point of view, because in the Bible it starts with Egypt. Okay, Moses taking the Hebrews out of Egypt. For sure, Egypt plays a very, very important role in the Bible. But if we look at things from a historical perspective, we can really start writing Israel's history from the Neo-Assyrian Empire. That's where we start having documents, inscriptions that allow us to write a history of Israel that is not based exclusively on the Bible, but also on archaeological evidence. And we see that there are in the biblical text some echoes, both of the events that went on and on during these centuries. I mean, encountering the Neo-Assyrian Empire, then the Neo-Babylonian, then the Persian, then the Hellenistic kingdoms. We have echoes in the biblical text of these encounters on two levels. First level, the what happened on the ground. Like we hear about the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel, and we have texts that also document these destructions on the Assyrian side. We hear about the Babylonians taking Jerusalem, destroying the first temple, and we have evidence from other sources, etc., etc. Okay, so we see that the fact that Israel was subjugated by these empires had all kinds of effects on its political, military, economic history. But what is also interesting is to look at the impact at the ideological level. Namely, how did Israel, when confronted with these empires, which all had imperial ideologies, how did it affect the way Israelites reflected about human kingship, but also divine kingship and God's power? And there are connections between these questions and the development of monotheism, for example. Because monotheism is basically a conclusion that some Israelites were pushed to draw because they faced the fact that their God had seemingly been less powerful than the God of the Babylonians, let's say, who had destroyed the first temple. So then you need a switch. Either you just say, okay, my national God is weaker than the gods of the Babylonians. Maybe I should go over and worship the Babylonian gods. Or, and that was the switch, you say, oh, my God is the universal God who actually is also pushing things behind the scene for the Babylonians as for all the nations of the world. And it was he, if I can use the he for God, it was he who decided that we should be conquered and defeated by the Babylonians because we had sinned. And this is the main theological explanation that we find in the Bible, which we often call the Deuteronomic or Deuteronomistic explanation for the evils that befell Israel. So you see that these events, these political confrontations, military confrontations with these empires had consequences at the ideological level, at the theological level. And so I was interested in tracing these developments from the Assyrians to the Greeks in order to ask the question, so what happens with Rome? Because, okay, one could imagine that Rome is just one more empire in the list of empires that Israel faced. And, once more, there will be taxes, there will be armies in Judea. But what is new? Where is there a new challenge? Or is it just a repetition of this kind of scenario with the repetition of the Jewish answers, meaning, for example, we have sinned and therefore God has used the Romans to punish us, which is a response, by the way, that you find in Jewish texts from the Roman period. It's not that it disappears. But I argue that there are new elements, and there are elements that make Rome a very unique challenge for Jews. And first, you have to think that the Romans were, when the Jews first encountered the Romans, which was in the 2nd century BCE, at the time of the Maccabees, then the Roman Empire was the empire of a people. The Roman Empire did not have a king, which was very surprising. And if you read 1 Maccabees chapter 8, you will discover that they were themselves very surprised to find such a superpower without a king. It's just so amazing. And not only that, by the way, but that the Romans were changing their leaders every year by election. So this was so different from the model of Hellenistic kings or Persian kings, and so that the Jews had known before. And so it was a people that looked paradoxically similar to Israel when you look at certain things. The first thing is that the Romans claimed to be the most pious people on earth. And this is something that we see even in Greek inscriptions already in the 2nd century BCE, that, wow, the Greeks themselves were struck by this Roman claim. Like the Greeks could say, we are philosophers, we are the most clever, but they didn't say we are the most pious. This was really typically Roman. But from a Jewish perspective, who is the most pious people on earth? It is Israel. So, wow, how strange. So we have another people who claims to be the most pious people on earth. Now, if you look at what the Romans considered to be another characteristic of Rome, it was the fact of having the best laws ever written, the best legislation. Like the Romans considered that they were geniuses in legal issues. Not in philosophy, not in the arts. Okay, they acknowledged that the Greeks were better than them, but for legal matters, that was the Roman thing. Now, again, if you think of Israel, what is Israel's, what are they supposed to be proud of? And this takes us back to Deuteronomy.
God's law.
God's law. I mean, we have the best law. There is no question in this realm. We are absolutely the best. This is the wisest law. It's God-given, etc., etc. And then, if you read Virgil, the Aeneid, you will see how, especially at the end of the 1st century BCE and 1st century CE, the Romans had this kind of vision, epic vision of being the faraway descendants of Aeneas in some way, and of having been elected by the gods of the Greco-Roman pantheon from the beginning of history, to become this very powerful nation which would rule over all the earth, basically, all the civilized world. So there was this feeling of having been chosen by the gods for this historical mission. And this historical mission also did imply ruling other nations, but also bringing peace. Everybody has heard about the Pax Romana, so the Roman peace that would be given and spread all over the world. Now, if you think about traditional Jewish messianic ideas, and if you look already in the book of Isaiah and then in later writings and up to rabbinic texts, if you look at the eschatological scenarios, you see that, well, in the end, Israel and the Messiah with God is supposed to rule over the nations. The nations will bring their wealth to Jerusalem, and there will be universal peace, but from Jerusalem, not from Rome. So you see, if you put all these elements together, Rome starts to become a very, very complicated figure for Jews, because it sounds as if it had similar claims to those of Israel and built its self-definition in a way that looks like that of Israel, which is why I argue some Jews, especially the rabbis, identified Rome with Esau, Israel's or Jacob's twin brother. Because what is a twin brother? A twin is somebody who looks like you, and a twin can be very close and friendly and brotherly, but it can also be a threat. And in the biblical story of Genesis, of course, Esau and Jacob have a very tense relationship, and at some point Esau wants to kill Jacob. Jacob has also stolen the rank of firstborn from Esau. So there is really a problem here of who is going to be the first between the two brothers. And so this feeling of rivalry between the twin brothers is, I think, what prompted the rabbis to identify Rome with Esau. And this expresses the very special place that Rome had for them in comparison with previous empires, which they did not identify with family members of Israel.
Wow. This is great. This is really good. This takes us into the heart of the matter. And I can imagine this is where you see these debates, these things happening. Even in Josephus, he gives these hints of Plato took from Moses, or they'll argue that certain people are taking from our ancestors. We had it first. And there's this race for who had it first, who goes back further, who has this pedigree for we had it first and we're really the ones. You need to learn from us. But he was very sophisticated. Obviously, being in the house of the emperor, I think he was being smarter than what we give him credit for. So we have to read him with a grain of salt and be careful not to take everything he says literally to the bank. Third question I have is the subject of conversion, because now that we're down into kind of a Roman era, we might have to bounce back a little bit to the beginning of the Second Temple period. But is the subject of conversion to Judaism as a practice prescribed in the Hebrew Bible, it's disputed, right? And a lot of people will go, there is no conversion in the Hebrew Bible. There seems to be a shift in this development from the Second Temple period into Rabbinic period. Can you elaborate on this? I know it's a huge subject, but tell us what is going on. Like, how did conversion begin, the birth of conversion, which I know you're going to write a book about at some point. So maybe just highlights.
So first, I would like to emphasize that conversion to Judaism is very different from conversion to Christianity. Why? Because what we call conversion to Judaism is not just a change of religious or theological belief. Basically, as several scholars have emphasized, like Paula Fredrickson or Steve Mason, conversion to Judaism is a change of ethnicity. It is first and foremost the fact of joining the Jewish people, of becoming a Jew. This is what it is about. Joining the Jewish people means you also adopt their God, their way of life, their laws, everything that goes with it. It's a package. But it's not necessarily primarily in terms of religious beliefs, even though we have sources that also emphasize the change of religious beliefs, in Philo, for example. So keeping that in mind, we have to reflect, what are we looking for when we're looking for conversion in the Bible? Because in some biblical texts, we have non-Israelites that join Israel. And we have this very early on. We have that already in the book of Exodus, where not only Hebrews go out and stand at Sinai, but also kind of mixed crowd, probably some Egyptians and, people who are not Hebrews and who are with the Hebrews, with the Israelites at Sinai, receiving God's covenant and law. So it seems that this entity, Israel, is already a bit open to integrating newcomers in some way. And we have to keep in mind that according to Genesis and according to many other biblical texts, Israel is originally defined as a family, a clan, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this is the genealogical model or the family model. But here at Sinai, we already have something different. We have people joining on the basis of the acceptance of the law. Now, there is a word in the Hebrew Bible, the word ger, from the root gur, which means to inhabit, to live in a certain place. We have the ger or the gerim in the plural, or people who are not Israelites, but they are settled with the Israelites in a permanent way. It's not like foreigners who come for 1-2 years and then leave again. There are other words for that. They are really settled among the Israelites. They share their social life, etc. And the way biblical texts relate to them varies. Depending on the biblical book you are looking at, you don't find exactly the same rules, the same status. So we see that there must have been evolutions already in the biblical period. But what is striking, if you look at things, let's say, in a synchronic way, like without thinking about historical evolutions, you see that in some texts they partake in the Passover meal, but if they want to do that, they have to be circumcised. And we find that especially in Exodus 12, 48, 49, which states explicitly, if the Gerim who live among you want to eat the Passover, they will have to be circumcised. Every male among them will have to be circumcised. And what is circumcision in the Bible? I mean, what is circumcision in Genesis? It is a ritual of covenant. So if they become circumcised, does that mean that they have entered the covenant and so have become really members of the people of Israel? This is an open question. Scholars disagree. So I'm not saying that I have a definitive answer, but I'm just asking. So this is a possible response. And John Collins from Yale University writes in an article on Gentiles in the Dead Sea Scrolls that in this passage in Exodus, we can already speak about proselytes because it's a late stage of the development of the Hebrew Bible. These are priestly writings, and that already conceive of Israel also as a kind of faith community that foreigners can join and they can become members, full members. So this is one way to look at it. Now, most scholars, I think, would say that conversion emerges later in the Second Temple period, but more precisely in the Hellenistic period, not Persian. And this is because this is because we have more sources and more evidence, especially the stories by Josephus, who tells us that the Hasmoneans, the Judean dynasty who was in charge of affairs in Judea in the 1st century, 2nd century BCE and 1st century BCE. So John Hyrcanus, one of the Hasmoneans, imposed conversion or Judaization on the Idumeans, where Israel, the Judeans' neighbors, southern neighbors, the area of Hebron. And so he forced them to Judaize, to adopt the laws of the Judeans, including circumcision. And they became Judeans. They were considered Judeans. So we have this. We have Qumran's text from the Hellenistic period who mentioned Gerim in the community of the Damascus document. So you have priests, Levites, Israelites, and Gerim within the community. So here there is no doubt, if we are looking for converts in the sense of people who have adopted all the laws of Israel, not just part of the laws, as some biblical texts would suggest, in the Hellenistic period, we find them. We find these people who have really accepted all the laws of Israel. Well, at least in theory. We were not there, so we don't know. But according to the texts, they are supposed to have accepted all the laws of Israel. But we can also think of conversion as something else. Nowadays, in our world, it is very common among Jews to think of converts as children of Abraham. Now, if we look for this notion in antiquity, we have to wait until the 1st century CE, the Roman context. We don't encounter the notion of converts, proselytes, as children of Abraham before the 1st century CE.
Might I just mention, as you're going, I do not want to interrupt this. This is amazing. When you say that, I want people to think genealogical model. I want them to keep that in their mind while you're mentioning this, because there is a time where the tribal clan family model, this genealogical model, is meeting with the convert, and how they meet, how they converge is what's so unique about what you're describing in the Roman era that I loved. So I just want them to keep that in mind, because it's like, how could a convert become Abraham's seed, if you will? And that is the technical term for sperm. Like, how can you become his sperm? And this is interesting. So,
Sure. If I may just add something to the conversion issue. Now, if you are looking for the conversion ritual, this is missing in the Bible, except for the mention of circumcision. And basically, we have to wait until late rabbinic writings to find a description of the ritual of conversion, which is a kind of disturbing for scholars, because, you have converts in the text, but we don't really know what kind of ritual they had to go through in order to become converts until we reach, the Talmud. Basically, it's only in the Babylonian Talmud that we have a full description of the conversion ritual. And it is only from the Tannaitic rabbinic literature, 3rd century CE, that we really have the combination of circumcision for males and immersion in the ritual bath as part of the conversion process. But it's probably earlier, but it's only in these late sources that it's explicit. So, and finally, if you consider conversion as the fact for a non-Jew of becoming a Jew in all respects, with no difference with a native Jew, this is really tricky. Because in rabbinic literature, you have many rabbis who will not consider a first-generation convert as exactly equal to an Israelite, to a native Israelite. So you see, depending on how you define conversion, what you have in mind, you will get very different answers. The issue of definition is absolutely crucial.
Wow. Okay, question about these. Questions come up when we talk. So forgive me for not running with our typical. This immersion, we see John the Baptist. I go back to what I know biblical. Here he is, of course. He's immersing people in the river. There may be elements of this earlier, but if you were to put a guess on this, because we don't have sources, when do you think the conversion water immersion process began? If you were to put a guess, because we just don't have good evidence. Do you think what date and time would you say that was a conversion process ritual?
I think it must have started at least in the Roman period. I mean, in the beginning of the Roman period. Maybe originally it was a way to wash the uncleanness of the convert's previous life, the fact that he had been in touch with impure food, idols, etc. So maybe this was really a purification ritual. And we have a lot of evidence for the development of ritual baths and deep concern for purity, starting in the Hasmonean period. So, and then 1st century BCE and 1st century CE, we find a lot of ritual baths in archaeological digs, and so I think this must have started already at that time, even if we find it only in later texts.
Thank you so much. All right, your work suggests that pagan Rome had a major impact on Jewish thinking. Please take us into a few examples, if you don't mind, of this.
Okay, so I will take just one example because it's complicated to explain. So I think we should focus on one, and then we'll see if we can do a second one. I will take the example of citizenship. So in the Hellenistic period, Jews were exposed to the model of the city, of the Greek city, of the polis, as you would say in Greek, to civic models. And when I say civic, I mean really like you need to have the institutions of the polis. It's not just any kind of grouping. So they were exposed to this, and they were apparently very impressed by the way the Greek cities functioned. And they started to adopt the vocabulary of citizenship, even to speak about themselves, like to speak about Jews living in different places. Like, for instance, Jews in Egypt speaking about Jews in Judea, and they would say, our fellow citizens in Judea. Even though there was no citizenship, like real citizenship. First, you had to have a city. And this city could give a citizenship. And it could have been Jerusalem. And it seems that actually the Hellenized Jews whom the Maccabees fought against obtained the status of polis for Jerusalem and may have started something like that. But it came to an end because the Hasmonean revolt put an end to this attempt. So Jerusalem was not a polis. There was no Judean citizenship, and there was no Jewish citizenship in the communities in the diaspora, but some communities in the Lagid kingdom in Egypt. So in Egypt, in the Hellenistic period, they started to organize themselves as polytemata. Now, what is a polytema? And you see, polytema, it sounds like politeia, polites, other words in Greek that mean citizenship, citizen, etc. A polytema was something ethnic in Egypt, but it functioned a little bit like a citizenship. You were a member of a polytema, you had certain rights, they had a certain autonomy, there were judges who could arbitrate between people, and this was integrated into the administration of the kingdom of the Ptolemies, but they were like a little bit autonomous. And we have found, archaeologists have found papyri from Egypt from the 2nd century BCE that show that the Jews in these polytemata call themselves citizens. So it was not a real citizenship, but you see, this probably helped also to appropriate the Greek vocabulary of citizenship. Now, when we move to Rome, what changes do we witness? Roman citizenship functioned in a very different way from Greek citizenships. Because Roman citizenship was not at all ethnic, especially if we speak of the 1st century BCE, 1st century CE, and onward. I mean, at the end of Augustus' rule in 14 CE, you had probably already 6 million Roman citizens, which would be impossible for any Greek city in the Greek world. So, the extension of Roman citizenship meant that it was something intrinsically different. The emphasis was on duties and rights, not on actual political participation in the assemblies, in the votes, etc. for obvious reasons at that time. And it was completely disconnected from who your ancestors were and whether you were from the line of Romulus or from something else. I mean, there were people from all kinds of backgrounds already at that time who had become Roman citizens. So we have here a completely different reality. And Roman citizenship was quite open. You know, there were many ways you could become a Roman citizen. So, of course, obviously, you could be born a Roman citizen. In that case, that comes close to ethnicity. But you could also be a freed slave, like a Roman citizen who manumitted his or her slave according to certain rules. The slave could become a Roman citizen. You could also have served in the Roman army, in the auxiliary units, and after 25 years of service, then you would receive Roman citizenship. You could receive Roman citizenship as an individual because you had maybe done a favor to the emperor, for example, and then you would receive Roman citizenship from the emperor. And if a community as a whole, or a city, or another kind of group had, helped the Romans in a very significant way, they could also be granted collectively Roman citizenship. And then they could even become a Roman colonia, for example. And finally, if you were a magistrate in a municipium under Latin rights, which was not a Roman citizenship, but then if you were in that case and you served as a magistrate, after that you would receive Roman citizenship. So there were all kinds of processes and all kinds of ways that you could become a Roman citizen, and it was very valued. I mean, there was even a war in 91-88 before BCE of some allies of Rome in Italy were not Roman citizens, and they fought a war in order to become Roman citizens, to be granted full citizenship. So it was an asset that was valued. So, and also we have to keep in mind that the Romans were praised for their openness, for their so-called generosity in granting citizenship. Like you are very open, and you welcome all those who are deserving, and you do not let people out because they are from a certain ethnos, or
And just to add to what you say,
sure.
The one thing that you said there in your book, and they really need to get this, is it wasn't just Romans patting themselves on the back. There was literature written by Greeks, people who were not Romans, that were going, man, no wonder we didn't, do so well. Look at how wonderful your laws are, and the way that you approach citizenship is bar none. Nobody is doing what you do. This will be the ruling universal kingdom, or the ruling universal, I guess you could call it a kingdom, that Rome will be successful. And it because of its openness to include people who just want to obey the law and are going to be civil, or what is it? The two things that they ask is obedience to our law, which unites us.
Taxes.
Huh?
You always have to pay taxes.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So yes, it's important to keep in mind that even Greek intellectuals and so praised Rome for this openness and this willingness to share their citizenship with others. So when you look at the Jewish writings from the Roman period, you see that this notion of citizenship had an impact at several levels. That the Jews were really impressed too by the way the Romans managed their citizenship. And if you look at the writings of Philo of Alexandria and Josephus in the 1st century CE, you will see that they also describe the Jewish politeia. They use the word politeia, which means a civic community. In that case, of the politeia of the Jews, they describe in terms that look similar to those used by the Romans. They will say that the emphasis is on the laws, that we are a community bound by common laws, and whoever wants to come and live under these laws and share our way of life according to these laws, he is most welcome. And we welcome new citizens, and we grant them the same honors as the native citizens. So they, in a way, they imitate the discourse that we find in Roman sources or in pro-Roman sources. And even in rabbinic literature, which is even more surprising because Philo and Josephus were, they were very much in conversation with Roman officials and so, and they had a direct experience of Rome itself. But the rabbis who wrote in Hebrew Aramaic and who were less directly exposed to Rome and to Roman power, to Roman representatives, they also were quite impacted by the Roman model of citizenship. And this has been shown not only by me, but by other scholars as well. And we are a whole group of scholars working on these issues. For example, it has been emphasized that the fact that the rabbis consider that a slave owned by a Jewish household can become a Jew once he or she is manumitted parallels the manumission leading to Roman citizenship in a Roman context. And I need to pinpoint that in the Greek world, this is impossible. You never have a slave once manumitted who becomes a citizen, or maybe he will become a citizen for other reasons afterwards. But manumitting a slave never allowed someone to become a Greek citizen. This was specifically Roman. And here you find it in the rabbinic text. And if you look at the Bible, you don't find anything of that. There is no model in the Bible for this procedure, for this transformation of the slave into an Israelite once he or she is manumitted. So really here, it is a case that we must conclude that there is an impact of the Roman way of doing things, and the Roman laws upon rabbinic legislation and rabbinic thinking. But we have other examples. For example, also when Romans granted citizenship to the father of sons, and let's say the sons received Roman citizenship too. So everybody received Roman citizenship. But because they received Roman citizenship as adults, not, let's say, after, they were not born after their father had become a Roman citizen, the family connection between the father and the children was not fully recognized. The Romans had a very specific notion of paternity, which is patria potestas, which is the power of the father upon his children, grandchildren, everybody in the household, basically. And this was a very powerful legal connection between the father and the children. This connection was not maintained between someone who has become a Roman citizen and his sons, who had also become Roman citizens. Even though they also became Roman citizens, the patria potestas was not established between them, which with a very important consequence. The sons would not inherit from the father. So some of them asked the emperor for the special privilege of also, being granted this legal connection. Now, if you look at the converts according to rabbinic legislation, you find a very similar phenomenon. A man who converts to Judaism and his sons convert together with him at the same moment, but they were born prior to his conversion, the paternity link will not be acknowledged by the rabbis, and the children will not inherit from their father. So here you see we go into very, very specific details of legal issues, and we see very striking parallels between the Roman laws and the rabbinic laws. And at the end of the day, it becomes really difficult to imagine that there was no connection at all, that there was no impact of the Roman legal system upon the rabbis.
This leads me to my next question, because a lot of these details are fascinating to discover. And it seems that it's not always a one-way street, but it appears that Rome's impact on the Jewish people definitely played a significant one-way street impact, if you will, in some of these examples. But as far as your work, how would you say your work complements existing scholarship on these issues? And are there any revelations? For example, did you have any moments when you were like, oh, like, my mind blew, and that makes sense, and it complements some of the other scholars, and it made that, it like connected the puzzle pieces that you didn't know, and then you saw it and you went, oh my goodness. And other scholars who you've talked to went, wow, I never knew that. Is there anything that you can give us an example of?
Yeah, sure. Well, I have long been puzzled by the fact that the rabbis define Israel's law, the Torah, as a law that is uniquely for Israel. And they invent a new concept, which is the concept of the 7 commandments of the children of Noah. I don't know if you've heard about it. There is a huge movement in the US, apparently, of people
Noahide laws, yeah.
Noahide who wants to be Noahides, not convert to Judaism, but become Noahides. So this is a rabbinic concept. And in most rabbinic texts, they will say that the Torah is only for Israel. And it's even forbidden to non-Jews to practice the commandments of the Torah. And this is so different from the vision of the Torah that we find in Philo and Josephus and other Jews writing in Greek, especially Philo. Philo has a very universalistic understanding of Torah and a very philosophical one. I mean, it goes together. He will say that the Torah, the law of Moses, is a natural law. It's the best written expression of the natural law, of the cosmic law of the world. And thus, non-Jews who just use their logos, their reason, their rationality, may, come to the conclusion that they must live in accordance with the Mosaic laws because they are good, they are intrinsically good. And he claims that there are people all over the Roman world who practice the Sabbath, for example, and other Jewish customs. Now, I thought, why did the rabbis develop such a kind of more national understanding of the Torah after such a long tradition of universal vision of the Torah? And looking at the Roman context of the rabbis actually gave me the answer to this question. Because if you look at what the Roman jurists write, such as Gaius, he writes that Roman laws, Roman jus civile, civil law, is only for Roman citizens. And as we said previously, the rabbis were impacted by this notion of Israel as a kind of citizenship. And they were impacted by the Roman way of looking at this. And so I suggest that we can understand the way the rabbis conceived of the Torah as a national law, as the law of only Israel's citizens, those who are Jews, those who are citizens of Israel, parallels actually the way the Roman jurists thought about Roman jus civile as pertaining only and exclusively to the Roman citizens. And it makes a lot of sense because rabbis are similar to Roman jurists in many ways. So in the end, it is not surprising that they really adopted this vision, this way of looking at the Torah. I'm not saying that there are not other factors, but I think this is one of the factors that played a major role.
So if I might poke in a little deeper here on this, today we have people, I knew a few, I don't really know, but I know of them, and we've talked a little here and there, who claim to be Noahides. They call themselves Noahides, and they are Gentiles who practice and worship the God of Israel today. And I thought to myself, the logical question with everything I study is, dude, why don't you just convert? Like, why don't you just become a Jew? Why don't you just do that? And it's so, I guess, what's the reverse of anachronistic? Because I'm thinking back then should be how things are practiced now. But why are they, what happened? And there's this weird thing where, well, we practice the 7 laws of Noah, and they have the 600 and, 616? I can't remember exactly, the 630 or whatever laws and commandments of Moses. But they're Jews, and there's still this genealogical, it seems, significance, even in modern Israel. It seems, I could be wrong, but I'm not 100% sure on this, but I thought, why don't they, do that? Did the change, because your book talks about this, becoming a citizen of Israel, the rabbis disagreed on how, like, could a non-Jew become a citizen of Israel? And some say, yes, they can. Some go so far to say, not only do they become a citizen of Israel, they can say the Our Fathers passage in Deuteronomy and claim that Abraham is their father as well. Did they end up down the road restricting that? Did the rabbis start to go, no, this isn't working. We need to restrict this to those who are our clan, our family, our genealogy, or I don't know. I don't really know too much of the history after that, but is that something that happened?
So first, we need to keep in mind that there are many, many voices in rabbinic literature,
right,
and many disagreements. And they do not, and some rabbis, stick to their own view and they disagree with their colleagues. And then there you have, in general, a majority opinion, but you have a multiplicity of views, and so you must be very careful, because if you pick up one sentence from a rabbinic text and you generalize and you say, oh, this is what rabbinic literature says, it is very dangerous.
Right.
So this being said, a few words on the Noahide laws. The Noahide laws, basically, they are meant to separate the Jews and the non-Jews. That is, precisely because there were all these Judaizing Gentiles in the 1st century CE and probably afterward as well, maybe a bit less, but we don't know. We know from sources like the Book of Acts in the New Testament and from Philo and Josephus and all kinds of sources. There were people who Judaized, who imitated Jewish customs, but they did not fully convert. They did not undergo circumcision. They did not become Jews.
Are they the God-fearers, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's, in some texts, they are called God-fearers, precisely. So the rabbis didn't like this kind of ambiguous status. They wanted things to be clear. They wanted Jews and non-Jews to be as clearly separated as possible. It's not always 100% possible, but as clear, as much as possible, to separate and to make a clear distinction between them. And so, which is probably why they codified the ritual of conversion slowly, and to make things clearer for everybody. And so the invention of the Noahide commandments is meant to say to those who did not want to undergo a full conversion and to become Jews, okay, you don't want to become Jews, that's fine. You can be saved. You can be, you can be nice guys in God's eyes. You don't need to become a Jew, but you need to keep a certain number of basic commandments. But don't practice the commandments of Israel. This is the idea. The idea is, if you start practicing the Shabbat and the dietary laws, and people are going to think that you are Jews, there will be a lot of confusion. So don't do that. Just, don't kill, don't steal, don't worship idols, etc., etc. And that's enough. And you will be fine. But if you want to practice the Sabbath and the feasts, the festivals, and Passover, etc., you must convert. That is, you must be circumcised. You must have the full process. So it's really a project of distinction between Jews and non-Jews.
Interesting. And I guess today, if someone wants to convert to become a citizen of Israel, that's still valid, right? They can still do that.
Yeah. So yes, I forgot the second part of your question. So the Noahide status or the Noahide laws is not meant to prevent people from converting. Someone who wants to convert can convert, even though the rabbis will sometimes suspect the conversion, and even more today. I mean, we know of cases of rabbis who are very harsh with converts, but the main thing is you can. I mean, you're allowed to, and it is always a possibility. But rabbis did not want everybody to become a Jew. They never had this kind of project. And in that, they are very different from the Romans, who extended their citizenship even nearly universally with Caracalla's edict in 212. So the rabbis did not have such a universal project of, converting everybody to Judaism and making everybody a Jew. Never. This is not what we see in the sources. So if you want to convert, you can, but you have to do the whole thing and seriously. And if you don't want to convert, just keep the no-hide commandments.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this opens up so many questions. You got to get the book. My next question is, we talk about Rome as Esau, and you have the book of Revelation, right? This author we call John on the island of Patmos, he keeps referring to Rome as Babylon. And I guess it's probably a quick, easy answer for you. I would think, and I'm going to guess the answer is this, and then you tell me, maybe you want to elaborate. I'm going to pretend I know the answer. The reason he is referring to them as Babylon is because Rome did what actual Babylon did to the first temple. They did to the second temple. And so because it was such a catastrophe for the first temple's destruction by the Babylonians, Israel was like, oh, and here is the same nickname for Rome to what happened in Babylon, I guess.
You are right. Absolutely. So one city. Babylon destroys the first temple. Rome destroys the second temple. Babylon deports part of the Israelites, or the elites at least, to Babylon. Rome takes many prisoners and sells many Jews as slaves, and etc. Babylon was a huge empire. Rome is a huge empire. I mean, you have all kinds of reason to make this parallel between Babylon and Rome and to assimilate Rome to Babylon. But this is in fact something that characterizes the apocalypses. We find it in the Apocalypse of John, also once in 1 Peter. And but then you find it in Jewish apocalypses like 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch. They also refer to Rome as Babylon, which makes sense also for Ezra, because since the speaker in 4th Ezra is supposed to be Ezra, he's supposed to write in the Persian period about the first destruction, but it is a way to address questions concerning the second destruction.
That's a very clever piece of literature, and reading that's a very moving book, by the way, for anybody who hasn't read it. It's got there's a lot of emotion in there, like, God, why? There's a lot of deep, it's really interesting. Can you imagine living through that? Think about that. Imagine your world crumbling. It's just a very deep question. So next question I have for you. What role did Rome play in Jewish apocalypticism and eschatology, if any? Do we see any impact from pagan Rome, which may have caused their apocalyptic fever? I call it a fever because Josephus actually mentions, I think, that it was like a fever, these apocalyptic zealots and these, the end is near, and they have this fever, I guess he uses this term. Did pagan Rome, what kind of role did they play in that apocalypticism? Because I think that the apocalypticism, if I'm looking at the sources correctly, it existed even before pagan Rome. In the Hellenistic period, probably impacted from Persia's ideology. And they have an eschatology of an end with fire and stuff. So does Rome play a role in that in some way that you know of?
So you are absolutely correct. Apocalyptic writings start in the Hellenistic period with Daniel, with the book of Daniel. And we have and the book of Enoch, the first Enoch. And we have all kinds of apocalyptic discourses already before Rome. And it continues with Rome. I mean, but I don't see a major change. I mean, like 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, apart from this very emotional tone that you mentioned for 4th Ezra, which is quite striking. It's not that the theological issues or answers are fundamentally different. It's more like a continuation. And it's the same problem again and again, like we are crushed by powerful enemies. And where are you, God? And why are you not saving us? But on the other hand, if we, what is more difficult to take into consideration is what happened in Judea. Here we have Josephus, who tells us a lot about the years before the war, before 66. And you see a lot of tensions and false messiahs and people claiming that God's kingdom will come soon, or, saying we must stop paying taxes to Rome and we must obey only God and things like that. So probably they claim to have received revelations and to have divine orders or things like that. But the problem is that since Josephus is hostile to these figures, he doesn't really share with us their reasonings, and he says very little. But we can see that there maybe one could speak of a kind of messianic eschatological fever, maybe not strictly speaking apocalyptic, in the sense that people received revelations, but in Judea before the first Jewish revolt. Yeah.
I guess maybe the reverse could have happened. I'm just throwing it out there. Maybe Rome's impact helped put a blanket over the fire of eschatology. Maybe they saw Rome isn't going anywhere. We need to stop doing this. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe they started to change over time, and Rome, instead of it being something that added gasoline to the fire, it might have been something that helped put out the fire. And said, hey, stop. 70 AD, Bar Kokhba, it's done. Stop. They're not going anywhere. God is on their side. Cut it out. And that may have been what helped slow down or stop the fire. What do you think?
Absolutely. And you remind me that I have not mentioned the terrible consequences of the three main Jewish revolts against Rome, 66, 73, and then the diaspora revolt, 115 or maybe 16 to 117, and then the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 136. And these had tremendous consequences for the Jews, which we need to mention. What happens? The first revolt, the temple is destroyed. Jerusalem is nearly destroyed. I mean, it is devastated. And the temple is destroyed, and it will never be rebuilt until now. And it was a deliberate political decision of Vespasian and continued by his successors. Vespasian ordered that the Jewish temple in Leontopolis in Egypt be destroyed as well. He didn't want any Jewish temple to stand because he had understood probably the religious dimension of the revolt. Another consequence, the tax of the half shekel, which used to fund the cult of the Jerusalem temple, was redirected to Rome to fund probably the reconstruction of the temple of Jupiter, the Capitoline temple of Jupiter in Rome, and then probably other temples afterwards. So this must have been very shocking for Jews, that the money that were used for God's temple in Jerusalem now served the temples of the pagan gods of Rome in Rome. Then the sacred vessels that used to be in the Jerusalem temple were carried to Rome. You can still see, the beautiful relief on the Arch of Titus on the Roman Forum. You can see the utensils brought from Jerusalem and carried in a procession during Titus and Vespasian's triumph in the streets of Rome. Now, these utensils, so the trumpets and the table and everything, they were carried and led in the newly built temple to the goddess Peace, Pax. And this was Vespasian's decision. He had this temple specially built in 75. And this is where the utensils from the Jerusalem temple ended, except for the Torah, which apparently was in his palace, the Torah scrolls. And it continues. Then with the last revolt, with the Bar Kokhba revolt, this is the main cause of the revolt. I mean, there are some debates among scholars, but I think the main cause of the revolt was Adrian's decision to rebuild Jerusalem as a Roman colony. And this was the end of the process. Like already the temple had been destroyed, the utensils had been brought to Rome, everything was redirected to Rome, and now even the city itself was replaced by a Roman city. And you understand why I said earlier that some Jews could feel that Rome was trying to substitute itself to Israel, not only symbolically, but even physically, with Aelia Capitolina, the Roman colony established where Jerusalem once stood. Like it's a complete erasure. Wow. So keeping this in mind, now I go back to your question. Yes, the rabbis, they reject apocalyptic thinking. They do not want people to get into that. They even reject what rabbinic literature calls a bat call, a heavenly voice. Like they seem to reject any kind of charismatic prophetic authority, because probably it was too much connected with messianic claims and the revolts. Bar Korva, according to certain sources, claimed to be the Messiah. So they were afraid of that. Like people who say, "Oh, I've heard from heaven that I've been chosen by God to free Israel," and then people would again revolt and again be murdered and everything would be destroyed. So I think the rabbis really try to calm things down, and this is why the apocalypticism is nearly never present in rabbinic literature.
Wow. I mean, that is just amazing. The way you are explaining this is unbelievable. We'll keep moving. What are the strongest criticisms of your work and how do you address them? I guess this question isn't very good because it just came out. Have you changed your mind on anything, though, over the course of your latest research?
While writing the book, while writing chapter 3, I changed my mind because chapter 3 is on military power and Jews' relationship to military power and how, what was the impact of Rome in that regard. And I thought, having read Daniel Boyarin, that I thought that, Rome was symbolized by its military force, and Jews would somehow reject this kind of model and would promote intellectual strength and spiritual strength rather than military prowess. And I ended up with mixed conclusions. Namely, yes, there are some texts that go in the direction of emphasizing spiritual power. Israel's power is prayer, is Torah study, etc., etc. We find that in Palestinian rabbinic sources, but we also find a different trend even in rabbinic writings, in which Israel's bravery and military prowess is celebrated. And you feel that you can feel that even in that respect, they have a kind of feeling of rivalry with Rome, and they say, no, we are really great fighters, and we've had great military victories in our history, even more than you, and we are even more courageous, and so and so. So the ethos of strength and of military valor remains present in the writings of the Jews who were living in the Roman Empire, but together, mixed with another reaction, which is the emphasis on spiritual strength, intellectual strength, etc. So it's a mixed picture. It's not new.
Moving into the next question that I have, and I made it short and simple. What kind of impact did pagan Rome have on Christianity? Which then makes you have to want to define Christianity here for a second. And I'm not necessarily getting at, maybe this is origins, because this is a big problem. There's a lot of problems we don't have answers for, but in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, that's a different question, I think. What I'm wondering, and you write in your book later, is Paul, you get into Philo, you get into Paul, things like this. What is going on in the early, what we call the Jesus movement is what I'm calling Christianity. Because one would argue, no, it's not Christianity, it's Judaism, a form of Judaism that is Hellenistic and is doing something radically different. Paul has this Jesus figure, and he's doing something different than typical Judaism, which says, like you said, obedience to law and service to God, that kind of stuff. Paul uses weird phrases in his Greek of justification by faith, whereas like when you read the Hebrew scriptures, it's like you could even argue that when it says that Abraham was justified, Paul says, by his faith, in the Hebrew, it says that Abraham says God is like righteous, right? So he is righteous. And it's not talking about Abraham's righteousness, but that God promised him a son and that God was righteous for this or something. So Paul's doing different things with the text, and it sounds like he has more of a belief in Jesus. Did any of Paul's weird thinking, and I say it's weird because it's definitely new, you don't see it anywhere before. At least I'm not sure. You might see it in Roman cults or something. But did pagan Rome have an impact on that kind of thinking that Paul might be having that you know of?
Before we talk about Paul, maybe let's look at the bigger picture, like the impact of Rome on the New Testament.
Okay.
So obviously it's a huge topic because the New Testament was written in the Roman world. So there must have been an impact, no?
Should we hold this question for a further episode?
Well, we can return to that, but I just wanted to mention, first I want to say we need to look at each text separately. We cannot make like generalizations about the New Testament as a whole. Michael Peppard has written a very interesting book on the notion of the Son of God in the Roman world. On the Gospel of Mark. I don't know if you're familiar with this book, where he argues that the Gospel of Mark presents Jesus as the adopted Son of God in a way that parallels or imitates and at the same time challenges the notion of the emperor as the adopted son of a god, or more exactly of a deified person, because originally emperors became gods only once they were dead. So they were not gods, they were deified persons after their death. So this is his argument. In that case, for example, I'm not convinced that this was really that significant because we have a very strong and well-established tradition concerning the Messiah, who is the Son of God, or concerning the King first in the Hebrew Bible, and then the Messiah. We have a very interesting text from Qumran, the Aramaic Apocalypse, 4Q 246, that mentions the Messiah as the Son of God and the Son of the Most High. So I think that on this issue, Jesus as Son of God, I think it really has to be understood within the Jewish framework as a whole, not so much as a response to the title of the emperor as son of a deified person. I think it makes much more sense in the Jewish tradition than in the Roman one. So you see, but it's interesting to try to imagine that some things could be a response to some Roman cultural discourse or political discourse. So now if we go to Paul, so first we must remember that according to Acts, Paul was a Roman citizen. And personally, I see no good reason to contest that. And Paul writes to the Romans, his epistle to the Romans. Who are the Romans? They are a community of believers in Rome, which is probably a mixed community with Jewish members and non-Jewish members who are all believers in Christ. And it is not surprising that it is precisely in this letter written to people who live in Rome that he emphasizes the need to obey the authorities. I don't know if you remember, it's in chapter 13. Paul writes that political authorities are instituted by God, and we must obey, and we must pay taxes, and we must give honor to whoever deserves honor or requests honor, etc., etc. This is a very problematic text in the history of Christianity because it was used by authoritarian powers and regimes like the apartheid in South Africa to impose, discriminations and inequalities and things like that, and people just had to accept and never to revolt, and et cetera, et cetera. So this is a very problematic passage, which, however, makes sense if you think that Paul was a Roman citizen writing to people in Rome who may have themselves been Roman citizens. And, certainly here we have no discourse of revolt. We are all good Roman citizens. We pay our taxes and we obey the authorities. The other reason, or let's say the other very important thing that we must keep in mind is the end of this passage in Romans 13, where Paul immediately adds, and now you know that the day is close. And it basically means that the end of times is very close. So it's an eschatological discourse. And if we understand what he says about the Roman authorities in this slide, it changes the message, because then it becomes something else. It's like, what's the point, There is no point in revolting against Rome, like Judeans will do in that same century, because, Christ is coming after tomorrow, so why should we bother? All these political powers, they are evil, but, it's not our concern to change this situation, because anyway, all this earth and heaven and everything is going to be ended soon and be completely renewed. So this is how I understand his position also in this letter. But in other respects, Paul is, we can say that Paul was influenced by Roman laws and Roman ways of thinking. And I think this comes to the fore in his discourse about adoption. Why? Because, so he speaks about believers in Christ as people who have been adopted by God, who have become children of God. And he also says that they have become children of Abraham. And obviously, they are not the biological children of Abraham, so it means that they are the adopted children of Abraham. Now, before Paul, in the Hebrew Bible, we do not really have the notion of adoption. We don't find that. We find that in law codes in Mesopotamia. I mean, it's something that existed that the Hebrews could have known very well. I mean, it's not, but it doesn't. It was never included among the laws of the Bible, like the possibility of adopting a child, for example. And I think that this resistance to the notion of adoption has to do with the importance of lineage and genealogy in ancient Israel. And because your status in Israel is determined by your ancestors and your genealogy. You are a priest. If your father was a priest, you're a Levite. If your father was a Levite, you're an Israelite. If your father was an Israelite, etc. So we don't have laws concerning adoption. We have very few stories of adoption. We have Moses adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh, but this is an Egyptian practicing adoption. This is not a Hebrew. We have the very ambiguous case of Esther, which I will leave aside, which is not very concluding. And Esther is anyway a late book. And then the first Jewish authors really used, and we don't have the vocabulary of adoption in the Septuagint. We don't have the vocabulary of adoption, like the term riothesia in Greek, until the writings of Paul and Philo in the 1st century CE. Philo doesn't use the term riothesia, but he uses other terms that are technical terms for adoption in Greek. So we must wait until Jewish authors from the Roman periods to find the terminology of adoption, which in itself, I think, speaks a lot. It tells us a lot about the fact that it is only in the Roman context where the notion of adoption was so prominent, especially politically, with emperors being the adopted sons of previous emperors. It is only in that context that it comes really to the fore in Jewish writings. So in Paul, But please interrupt me if you want me to clarify.
No, I just wanted to make a point. You made a comment, and there's going to be people probably watching who are going to want the answer to this. And you're making your case as we speak on that statement. The statement is, how do you know that that Paul's audience are not genealogically Abraham's literal seed? And we're getting there about this adoption thing, because in Romans 9:4, you mentioned in your book, I think it's 9:4, 9:6. I think it's 9:4, where he talks about, and to Israel pertaineth the adoption as sons. And so they'll go, well, see, he's talking about Israel according to the flesh, to them pertains adoption. So they'll argue, like kind of like a fundamentalist will, well, only Israelites according to the flesh get adoption. And they don't really know this whole adoption idea that you're bringing up. So I guess as you're explaining this, I'm letting the audience know you're in effect explaining how we know that his audience is not only made up of genealogical Jews that would have been the genealogical tie to Israel, or at least in part, because I don't know how Paul would have felt about a guy who proselytized before he hears Paul at all, and this guy becomes a Jew, if that is something that has already happened, and now he's hearing the Jesus message. Is he, so that's a different question we don't really get into, but I would love to hear you elaborate on this adoption thing, because I think this will explain that problem away.
Okay, if we want to understand what's going on, we need to keep in mind that there are basically 3 different models to define Israel in the Hebrew Bible. The first model is genealogical. Israel, they are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay, this is one. The second model we already talked about, the covenant at Sinai, the people who have accepted the covenant and the laws of God and who live according to these laws, etc., which allows converts to join. And we have also a third model, which is less massive, but nevertheless present, which is the model of Israel as God's adopted children. Why adopted? Because in the Hebrew Bible, God doesn't really beget children. It's not Jupiter. He doesn't make love with a mortal and has sons and daughters. And so we are speaking about an adoption, not a real filiation in any kind of biological sense. I mean, for us now, we are so used to that, it doesn't make sense. But we have to keep in mind that gods and goddesses in the ancient world could beget children. So, for instance, in Jeremiah chapter 3, God says to Israel, you are my son, and you are going to inherit the earth, etc., etc. There is this notion that also this is a way to define Israel. They are God's children. So, Paul, what he's concerned about in Galatians and Romans is to allow the non-Jews who believe in Christ to become children of God. This is what really matters for him, okay? To participate in the blessings that were given to Israel, and the main blessing being this identity of children of God. But he faces a difficulty because being children of God is the definition of Israel. You are a child of God if you are an Israelite. I mean, if you are a member of the people of Israel. So he still needs to argue that they have become children of Abraham. They have entered into this entity that is the people of Israel in their own way. They are integrated into a new lineage through the procedure of adoption. Because adoption is precisely about changing the lineage of someone. So this is very useful for people who are fond of genealogical thinking, like Paul and like the rabbis. If genealogy matters, if lineage matters, then you cannot just take the guy and say, oh, come in, the community is open, just become a member. because the community is conceived of as a family. And how do you integrate somebody into a family that is defined by lineage? Only through adoption. This is precisely what adoption did in a Roman context, also in a Greek context, but there are reasons why the Roman context works even better. One of the main reasons is, when in a Greek context, if you had already a son, you could not adopt another son. Whereas in a Roman context, you could have several children, several sons, and you could still adopt a son. There was no problem. Now, Abraham obviously already had sons, already had children. So it makes sense. In a Roman context, it makes sense. He could adopt, additional children, no problem. Of course, I'm speaking about things that can sound a bit absurd. We are facing here a kind of double legal fictions. First, the legal fiction of adoption itself, and adoption is a legal fiction in every culture, because you say somebody who was not born the child of this person will be considered as if he or she had been born the child of this person. So you really insert this person in a new genealogy. The second legal fiction in the case of the converts and Abraham is the fact that we are doing as if Abraham was still alive and was still able to adopt people. Of course, he's dead a long time ago. So we have double legal fiction. But this is what stands behind Paul's reasoning. By the way, I don't think Paul is inventing that. I think that he's taking that over from Jews of that time, of his time, the first century. And we have to keep in mind that, it seems that Paul studied in Jerusalem with a Pharisee, Gamaliel. So he is not that far away in his mental world from the rabbis originally, or from, let's be more precise, from the Pharisees who later on, according to the scholarly consensus, will become the rabbinic movement. So
he's no dummy, and he is aware of that world. And I just want to say, I thought it was interesting you take the adoption angle. For those who are like, where's she getting this from? Well, she knows the Roman culture, she knows the law, but also the impact. The whole book's about the impact of pagan Rome on Jews. But there are rabbinic writings that run with this even further, and they complement these ideas. So to give an idea for somebody, to use your famous example, I'm grabbing your example. So this, you have to get the book. I can't remember the rabbi, but you'll be able to tell off the top. I don't know if I can't remember his name. But he says, Abram's name was Abram, and Philo defines this as high father, or like this. The name for Abram before he's renamed to Abraham means high father, and then his name changes. God changes it and calls him Abraham, the father of many goyim. And the whole argument, if you go back to Genesis, we know what that means. Like, that doesn't mean non-Israelites. He's going to be the father of just many nations. His own seed is going to become many nations. And in the story, you kind of see that, but then other people attach to them. So here it's like saying, well, look, this is kind of prophecy in saying Abraham's going to be the father of many goyim. And the term diachronically, I think that ethne has become for non-Jews, anyone who's not an Israelite. So here they're making this inclusion using their Pesher type interpretation to find a way to include people who are not of the genealogical line of Abraham by using their own scripture. They're using exegesis, if you will, to try. We found a way. We know it says that the non-Jews would be coming in, and that's the way they were interpreting it. And Paul was doing the same in a way.
Absolutely. It's very striking that both Paul and the later rabbis quote the same verse from Genesis 17, saying that Abraham will become the father of a multitude of nations, to argue that he becomes the father of the proselytes, of the converts. Now, I think that this idea, in rabbinic writings, we find this idea very clearly only in the Jerusalem Talmud. which is quite late. But it is attributed to a rabbi of the 2nd century CE. But never mind. I mean, even leaving that aside, there could have been a kind of oral tradition running from the 1st century to the 4th century. We have other examples of ideas that, show up in late sources, but in the end, we have ways to show to demonstrate that they already existed previously. So what is striking is that originally the Mishnah, which is beginning of the 3rd century, rejects the possibility that the non-Jew who converts can say the blessing like, "Oh God of our fathers," which is, if you follow a kind of genealogical line of thinking, okay, this makes sense. He was not born a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, so he cannot say the prayer, "God of our fathers." Now, the Jerusalem Talmud comes and reverses this position completely and says, oh, yes, he can. He can recite "God of our fathers" because Abraham is his father. And then they quote Genesis 17, arguing that, this is the proof text that shows that, yes, this was foretold a long time ago, that, yes, many non-Jews would become Abraham's children. And the Hebrew here has no word for adoption. I'm not arguing that the word adoption is in the text, but it is presupposed, because obviously Abraham is not becoming their biological father. He's becoming their legal father, if you want, their adopted father. And what is also very interesting is that both in the case of Paul and in the case of the rabbis, in these two cases, there is an issue of inheritance. And adoption always has to do with inheritance. This is one of the major aspects of being adopted. It means that you become heir to the person who has adopted you. And in the Talmud, the issue is inheriting the land, because the prayer is connected to bringing the first fruits from the land. And so there is a link to the issue of inheriting the land. And the promise of the land was made to Abraham. So only the descendants of Abraham can inherit the land. And so this is a way to include the converts into these, well, at that time, eschatological blessing, when they will receive the land. And for Paul as well, he speaks a lot. If you look at the passages in Galatians and Romans, there is also the vocabulary of inheritance and being heirs. Now, Paul has a kind of spiritual reading of the inheritance of Abraham, even though at some point he speaks about the inheritance of the world. But I think that mainly what he has in mind is inheriting God's blessings, especially the identity of Israel as children of God. Like inheriting this particular identity that is connected to the people of God. Your book, it goes even deeper, and I love this whole thing because it explains that enigma, I like to call, of what's going on here. It's radically different than what we really see before. And then Paul's really strange argument of Galatians 3, where he says, it does not say to his seeds, plural, but to his one, Christ, who is Christ. He's making an interesting thing there, because you mentioned how God did not beget any children, literally. And even in the case of the birth of Jesus, if we, and this is speculation, but there's no reason to say that Paul knows of a birth narrative, like a celestial birth narrative for Jesus. But let's just suppose that he did. In like Luke's birth narrative, you see this very similar to Plutarch, where the gods actually, it's not having sexual union, but there's a divine thing. So I wonder if there's this like adoptionistic idea, not only of Jesus, but then he is kind of another Abraham. So in him, he's adopting by faith in him many children. I don't know. There's a lot of things to consider. But the idea is that he's making this, what I would call a convoluted argument,
but it's sophisticated. It's just a convoluted one to say, listen, it's not talking about the many different children. And I think what he's doing there, correct me if I'm wrong, is he's actually kind of taking away the power of the people who are trying to proselytize his audience and make them fully converts. So he's saying, don't listen to these guys, because the scripture says, and it's not saying to the many seeds. So these people who are saying, we'll make you into a child of Abraham by converting you. No, there's only one, and it's Christ. Even they need to know that. They need to just be in Christ. Taking on the law is a curse, and all of these convoluted arguments that he makes to keep his audience from converting fully. Am I right or wrong?
You are right that there is a polemical context to his sayings, especially in Galatians, where he's fighting against people who are Jewish Christians and who try to argue that the non-Jews, the ethne, must first of all convert to Judaism, that is, become Jews, adopt the law, be circumcised, etc., and then they can become, Christ followers. And only if they become Jews will they be considered, part of God's people and God's blessings, etc., etc. Paul is arguing against them. He doesn't want the non-Jews to become Jews. He thinks that Jews can remain Jews and non-Jews can remain non-Jews, and both can be united in this new entity that is the church and God's family. But each one with his or her own distinct identity. He doesn't want people to become Jews if they were not born Jews. And this is very important to keep in mind. Absolutely.
Okay, so I must admit that we have at least 10 or more questions, right? And
time is running.
Huh?
The time is running.
That's what I was saying. I think
and I have another meeting.
Well, I was going to ask you if we could pick up continuing this amazing conversation for our audience in the future. Is it okay if we do that?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Like, this has been fantastic. I really, really, really appreciate it, because I have had, just for our audience sake, and we're going to go deeper into this as we get into the next episode, I have been trying to understand this idea of how Gentiles are becoming Abraham's seed. I always said, oh, they're spiritual descendants now. They're spiritual. Well, some people go, show me in the text where it says they are spiritual children of Abraham. Spiritual. It never uses the term spiritual, but it's implied. If you have Israel according to the flesh, is there an Israel according to the spirit? I don't know. These are things I started to ask myself, because some of the church fathers use that language. But you have helped solve a huge riddle that is on the ground in the first century, dealing with the Roman environment, and you see the reflection through rabbinic literature. So I have to say thank you so much for, out of all the academics in this area that I've been trying to figure out this answer, you have been the most clear, and you have had so many sources that you don't beat around the bush. You went right to it, like right to the jugular. And I went, whoa, okay, this is a good book. I really want everybody to please go get you a copy. Really. If you're interested in the conversion stuff and you really want to get into this whole dilemma, chapter 5, but we're going to go through this whole thing. We're going to really want more people to take a closer look to this book. This is a fascinating book, Jews and their Roman rivals, Pagan Rome's challenge to Israel. Anything you'd like to say to our audience before we go?
Well, it's worth the time that you will spend reading a quite long book, I must admit. But I could have made several shorter books rather than one big book. But I also wanted people to understand the connections between the different chapters, because in the end they are all, except maybe for the first one, which is this summary of the previous history before Rome. But the 4 chapters that follow, they are very much connected, and I think each one adds to the demonstration, and they are all the more convincing when they are read together. But you can always choose to start with the last one and then read from the beginning. No problem.
Thank you for your time. I really do appreciate it, and I I hope we can do this in the near future and continue where we left off. It's been a pleasure, a serious pleasure.
Thank you for your invitation.
Thank you. I look forward to getting it. Let me know what you think down in the comments section. Go get the book. I really want your opinion after knowing what she writes. If you have any criticisms, throw them there. She could use an Amazon review, of course, as well. And never forget, ladies and gentlemen, I'm willing to adopt you. You just got to say 3 words. We are MythVision.